This week, we're going to spend some time talking about ethnography. And ethnography is really the hallmark methodology of cultural anthropology. Malinowski was really the first to engage in ethnography, particularly this component of participant observation that we'll talk about. But to this day, ethnography and cultural anthropology are tightly intertwined with one another. So, one of the things that distinguishes ethnographic fieldwork from other types of social research is this kind of alliance to and following of certain what we call ethnographic techniques. And so, these methods have been around for more than a century and are an effective tool for helping cultural anthropologists understand social complexities. So, when we talk about, last week when we were talking about kind of science and humanities and whether how we could do both quantitative and qualitative research. Cultural anthropology is the subfield of anthropology that is the most qualitative. So what we're doing is we're describing kinds of the natures of social relationships. We're kind of painting a picture, telling a story, giving others an idea of how these different populations live. And a lot of that data, it just simply can't be quantified. We can't turn it into complex mathematical and statistical models, for example. Um, so, because of that, when we talk about the methodologies of, let's say, evolutionary anthropology or archaeology as being distinct from cultural anthropology, we have to recognize just what makes up this, these ethnographic methods. Um, so one of the things that distinguishes cultural anthropology is this nature of holism. Um, we to talk about anthropology as a discipline being holistic, studying all about the human condition, but what cultural anthropology is studying is all about the culture, right? And so, really looking at how humans exist in part of a greater overall social structure, greater overall culture, and studying all aspects of their social life simultaneously. Anthropology, and particularly ethnography, is characterized as being a long-term kind of project. Um, Ethnographies focus on life over the long term for at least a year, sometimes multiple years, because you can't just, let's say, take a snapshot from a single month or 3 months, even. If you think about academic anthropology, what happens a lot of times is once somebody has a position at a university, they go to the communities with which they work only periodically over the course of the year. So they might go for the summer term, for example, or for a few weeks while the school's on winter break. And we can't expect that to describe all aspects of an individual's culture. When we look at seasonality, for example, if you're only going during June, July, and August, well, that's going to be the same season every year. So let's say you just want to get some data that's as simple as what comprises the diet of the population that you study. Um, Even tropical areas have distinct seasonality. And so if you're only going the same 3 months of a year, every year you're going to miss out on the suites of resources that are consumed during other seasons. So this is why ethnographic fieldwork requires this long kind of time investment. And then ethnography and cultural relativism come hand in hand, right? We talked last week already about how we really have to balance and work hard to overcome ethnocentric biases. This tendency towards ethnocentrism is a human universal, a cultural universal. Everybody looks at the cultures that they encounter that are different from kind of this framework of their own. And one of the big challenges as an anthropologist, and particularly when engaging in ethnography, is to shift that perspective. And what better way to shift that perspective than living with the community that you're studying, engaging in everyday tasks and social relationships with the people that you're studying. All right, so Fieldwork ethnography is the defining method of cultural anthropology. It allows insights that wouldn't be possible with short visits, surveys, or brief interviews, right? People don't always do what they say. And so one of the best ways to kind of untangle what the say versus what the do is to spend lengthier periods of time with them, making notes, observing all aspects of their social life. Um, and so ethnography is able to yield an understanding of a culture and behaviors that people themselves might not even be aware of. So, let's take a relatively simple behavior that we do. Let's look at field work in an American mall, for example, right? Obviously, malls are closed during quarantine type settings and all, but think about the last time that you went to the mall. What were some of the behaviors that you might have observed being an outsider, right? One of those would be etiquette on things like staircases and escalators. We tend to stand on the right, and so when we're going up and down stairs that are two-way, right, we've got bidirectional traffic. So you'll be on the right as you're going up, you'll be on the right as you're going down. That stops any kind of collision between people. Etiquette's different on an escalator um, because escalators only move in one direction. So, that whole question of do you move past somebody on an escalator or do you just stand still and wait your turn? Typically, even in settings where there's like moving walkways that are unidirectional, if you're going to stand, you stand on the right. That leaves an avenue on the left open for people who want to move a little bit faster. So these are things we don't consciously think about, right? You don't give yourself a pep talk every time you're going to get on a set of stairs, like, all right, you can do this, right? Stand on the right, walk up the stairs on the right. This is just something that has been kind of reinforced, maybe not even with intentionality, but just kind of subconsciously, unconsciously reinforced just through your upbringing, through observing your parents, through hanging out with your friends, through the negative reactions that you might get from other people if you happen to be on the quote unquote wrong side of the stairs. The other thing to notice about the mall is kind of the direction that you move around and where you stand when you're moving around. I mean, if we think about a mall like Coronado Center, right, this would be particularly true for the section of the mall where you've got both a first floor and a second floor. So, kind of that area around the food court and particularly the second story above the food court, right? Um, do you walk on the right of this big, vast, open atrium, or do you walk on the left of this big, vast, open atrium? And when you do so, do you stand on the right of that section? Do you stand on the left of that section? So, just interesting things that even with something as simple as a shopping trip to the mall, you can, when you challenge yourself to think outside the box and to observe people's behavior as if you're an outsider, you can find that there's kind of rules, unspoken, unwritten rules into how you move through the mall. So, one big push with ethnography is learning, getting an understanding of, and being able to try to see an individual's culture through their own eyes. And we call this distinction an emic perspective. So, when we talk about field work, we talk about two perspectives. We talk about an emic perspective or the native's point of view, and we talk about an etic, ETIC perspective or the scientist's point of view. When you live for a long period of time among a population, you're not necessarily automatically going to develop cultural relativism, but it does increase the likelihood that you'll get some sense of the world in the terms that local people themselves understand. This isn't automatic, though. This really requires kind of an active shifting of your thought processes. So, as we seek to see things in terms of a local context, we start to understand that the things that people say and do make more sense. We move away from this outsider's viewpoint or this scientific viewpoint of analyzing life and start to understand the whys of the cultural view. And so this can become incredibly important when we're talking about some of these behaviors that seem kind of off the wall or out of the realm of what we as researchers usually engage in or observe. And so it can be something as simple as, understanding the roots of polygyny, right? Most of us thinking about relationships or marriages that are non-monogamous, we have almost a sense of revulsion about it. Like, I mean, why would you want to share your husband with another wife, right? We gravitate towards shows like Sister Wives on TLC because precisely because they are so out of the ordinary, right? We watch things like Fear Factor, where people have to eat bugs. We watch now one of the newer ones is Gordon Ramsay Uncharted, which same kind of thing, eating some of the native foods. And one of the things that Gordon Ramsay's been exposed to is eating insect, particularly insect larvae, right? We, when we view the world only in our own culture's perspective, we miss out on some of the whys. We might think, why on earth would a person ever eat insects? Well, I mean, insects are really, really high in protein and fat, particularly insect larvae. And I mean, really, we could solve our global food problems, our global food insecurity, if we could just get people in Western cultures to kind of wrap their heads around the idea of eating insects. Why do we characterize insects as pests and something to be viewed with revulsion versus seeing them as a valid part of anybody's dietary preferences? Um, this can be incredibly hard when we start to talk about behaviors that we may feel some sort of ethical or moral disdain for. So, we're going to watch a film this week for your weekly kind of learning activity, and that film is going to be one called Maasai Women, and that film looks at kind of the coming of age ceremony that young Maasai women experience once they reach menarche, and part of what they have to engage in is a clitoridectomy, um, a ceremony where their clitoral hood is removed and part of the clitoris itself, which is viewed in their eyes uh, as any kind of puberty rite of passage. Well, this is something that kind of from a global perspective, an international perspective, more and more organizations, the UN, for example, have come out against any kind of what we call female genital mutilation, just even the terminology that we use, clitoridectomy versus, or female circumcision versus female genital mutilation, right? We get an emotional kind of response to the language that we use to label that behavior. So just something to keep um, in mind is that it's not automatic that we shift to that emic perspective. We really have to challenge ourselves as anthropological researchers to understand the whys of various behaviors in other cultures. I can think of another anecdote. In the Cameroon, there's a widespread practice of breast ironing. So when girls start um, to progress through puberty and develop their breast tissue, their mothers will take hot irons and press it on that breast tissue um, to flatten the breasts. And what this does is it destroys the connective tissue so that instead of breasts being like perky and facing outward and upward, they just lie flat against the rest of the girl's torso. This seems horrible, right? It seems really judgmental. It seems really, really almost like torture, right? But the whys of it, girls, once they start hitting puberty, are at a much greater risk of sexual assault. And so by ironing their breasts, it lowers the likelihood that they're going to be victims of sexual assault because it's believed that the breasts aren't going to be as noticeable and then therefore they're not going to be kind of the subjects of sexual assault. And so we can understand the why of it. It doesn't mean that we condone it, let's say. But when there's a really high likelihood of something like sexual assault, of something like your daughter not being eligible for marriage, there's a lot more tendency to go along with cultural norms, even if those cultural norms are somehow hurtful to the people who are subjected to them. So we have to work really, really hard to avoid cultural tunnel vision. Okay. And so tunnel vision is associated with um, tunnel vision is associated with um, ethnocentrism, and so as we observe cultural practices, we have these unquestioned kind of tacit meanings and perspectives that we draw from our own culture that can prevent us from seeing and thinking in terms of another culture's uh, tactics and perspectives. So if it's left unchecked, it becomes full-fledged, blown out ethnocentrism. Tunnel vision isn't unique to Americans or Europeans. Every culture around the world has ethnocentric tendencies. And we often engage in the use of key informants in ethnography. So what that means is we're asking for someone's help. We're asking someone from within the community to give us insight into how the locals, how this culture, this society views these certain behaviors, and so informants feel that their ways of doing things, their moral, ethical, and legal codes, their way of thinking about the world are correct, and everyone else's are flawed. So even when we're using an informant's perspective, we innately have their own kind of version of tunnel vision wrapped up in that. We're not claiming that other cultures' ways of thinking are better than our own. Rather, we're just trying to unravel that local cultural logic. So here we'll take our first break after this slide as we think critically about ethnography. Just spending time in the field, making observations, and speaking with locals isn't enough to shake an anthropologist out of his or her own cultural tunnel vision. Why not? Right? Why do we not immediately shift to an emic perspective when we observe another culture and talk to people from another culture? And so challenge yourself to think about what are some of these other ways that anthropologists could avoid cultural tunnel vision, right? And really try to relate that. We're going to delve into these ethnographic techniques more specifically. And so I want this question to kind of be in the back of your mind as we move forward and examine these kind of ways of doing ethnography so that you can see how these inherently help us to step out of our ethnocentric um, tunnel vision kind of mindset.